I would like to introduce Ellen Effers, who will introduce our program for today. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very excited to have with us today Professor Barbara Mennel, who's the Rothman Chair and Director of the Center for Humanities and the Public Sphere at UF. And as you know, this whole program is being presented by members of that center. Barbara has a joint appointment, German Studies and Languages, Literature, and Culture, and Film Study programs of the English department. Barbara is really a force to be reckoned with. She is one of the most organized and knowledgeable people I have met at UF. And that's saying a lot because we've had some really dynamic speakers in other programs. But in all fairness, she organized this program and talked with me about it. And I thought that it would be interesting to members of ILR. So I hope I'm not wrong in my assessment here. You should know she is also an author. Her most recent work is Women at Work in 21st Century European Cinema, which was published in 2019. She has co-edited the collection Spatial Turn, Space, Place, and Mobility in German Literature and Visual Culture, 2010. And Turkish-German Cinema in the New Millennium, which is a 2012 book. In this particular program, Race, Violence, and Trauma in Silent Cinema, Barbara will discuss the racist representation of Afro-Americans in early cinema and its counter-representation of violence against Afro-Americans in two exemplary films. And I can't think of a subject that's probably more timely than what Barbara has chosen to present today. So with that introduction, I will turn the meeting over to Barbara.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Ellen. Can everybody hear me well?
Yeah.
Okay, that's great. I almost wish Ellen wouldn't have called me the most organized person she met at UF, or that she would have held off till the end, because I do have a new great setup in my office where I wanted to speak from to you today. And it just didn't work out. So I'm sitting in my office on my own little laptop, and I'm talking to you from there. And so no new technology. So I hope everything works. It will be a little bit of a toggle back and forth. I do want to show you two clips. So then I will get out of the PowerPoint and back into the PowerPoint. But let me start by sharing the PowerPoint. And you can let me know. Maybe Jeff, I see you. If you could just give me a thumbs up. Great, thank you. So my lecture today is called Race, Violence, and Trauma in Silent Cinema. It is part of our series, Legacies of Violence. I put my email address there. The topic Legacies of Violence came out of a conversation with Ellen. And so I actually wanted to encourage you, if from this series you have any ideas of how one could continue the conversation, what would be follow-up topics, what is interesting to you, feel free to let me and Ellen know. I think thinking about, what are issues that concern you that we can deepen is a really interesting way to then approach faculty to think about how to put it together in a class. I also want to say we are the Center for the Humanities and the Public Sphere. which means we actually do not have faculty who are part of the center. So we do go to the different humanities departments and then can ask faculty members who works on a certain topic. So that's how we put this together. I also want to say that because of the pandemic, we will continue some of our programming virtually, and we always invite everybody to all of our programming, virtually and in person. I will send a link to Julie to forward to all of you, and you can sign up for our e-newsletter where you will get all of our information for all events related to the humanities at UF and in the community. As we are called the Center for Humanities in the Public Sphere, outreach, serving the public is part of our mission. And, you know, if there are ever ways that you want to organize a bus to come and that we can organize parking for you that's closer to the event, those are all things that we're willing to do and that we're happy to do, and to which I will invite you. Moving right ahead, yes, Ellen said I teach film. Early cinema is actually not my particular area of expertise. My particular area of expertise is contemporary cinema. But I regularly teach silent cinema. I always have a unit on the question of racial representation in early cinema. And I kind of thought that it might be nice to this audience to think about silent cinema. I myself, even though I'm a little younger than you, grew up that when I was a kid and we went to my uncle's house, he would get out the old films and he would, you know, do mechanically project the animation for us. And so film was much more associated with that physical space, with the, you know, the noise of the projector, very different, and the collective experience, which I think is very important to what we're thinking about today. What was the collective experience of watching films about race in the early 20th century? Very different than the young generation now consumes film, which is much more individualized. I do want to connect it, however, also to the lecture that Professor Adler gave last week and the entire topic and origin of the series, and that is the current violence, or the violence that we learned last week is not current, not new, but what is new is the ability of people in the street to record and then immediately circulate. And there's something about that immediacy of recording and immediately uploading and being a witness in that moment that updates a much longer discourse about race and witnessing and violence against African Americans. But there's also a fundamental difference in terms of visual culture from the past, where you had that moment of recording, then you had development, and then you had projection and consumption. So there was always a time lag that we don't have anymore with digital media. So as I said, I'm going back, and I'm going back to the early 20th century. And one of the things that we have to think about when I'm talking about how was film viewed in the early 20th century is that we had segregated cinemas, right? So you had cinemas that were catering to whites, and you had movie theaters that were catering to African American. Of course, also sometimes had upstairs, downstairs, but from records of fire departments, we know that there were also cinemas that were entirely segregated. Now, that also means that you had segregated film industries, right? It also means that you had segregated distribution. And what we mean with distribution is how many films were produced, and then how many films were sent out to be shown. So because you can imagine that segregation, of course, wasn't absolutely equal, often there were fewer African American films that were circulating. This has an effect now also for the history and the legacy, because very often those films would deteriorate earlier, they would not be held in archives, and they would disappear because there were fewer of them. So there's a kind of, circular logic to this kind of form of discrimination, that then you also have fewer archival materials at your hand if you want to think about separate, segregated film histories. So in order to give you an idea of the relationship between the material conditions that I talked about and representation, which is what we think about in film studies, right? We think about both how were films made, what were the conditions of distribution, what were the conditions for audiences to view films, but also what do we see on the screen? Ways in which African Americans, Asian Americans, Latin Americans, white Americans, women, men were represented. How did that feed into stereotypes? How did it work against stereotypes? What were the conditions of representation? So those are the big questions that we deal in film studies. And to make it easy today, I'm using two examples. And one, W.D.Griffith, is pretty much the most famous early film director in American cinema. And Micheaux, lesser known, often not known to the wider public, but a really important early African American director. So I just want to give you a little bit more background to segregated film industry. So in the 1920s, we're talking about silent film today. The film industry had not yet moved to Hollywood. The film industry was still located in on the East Coast. So upstate New York, New Jersey, Florida, because of the weather. And the African American studios were not necessarily owned by African Americans. So the Norman Studios in Jacksonville, which you can still visit the studio, recently showed this film, The Flying Ace, here in town, and the grandson of the Norman Studios was present. And that was a white-owned studio, but it employed a Black cast. Now, one of the things that you will see when you watch these early, they were called race films. So they weren't called films with African Americans. They had a sort of generic title, right? One of the differences to the dominant white films with white actors produced by neutral but really white studios was that they had very differentiated roles. Often had, and you see this here, you have a pilot, he was in the military, right? You would have doctors, you would have policemen, but you would also have criminals, you would also have housewives. So one of the things that really differentiated and distinguished the race studios and the race films was that they had a whole range of characters in terms of class, in terms of professions, that were all African American. I do want to talk about, even though I will not show you a film, but I do want to talk about blackface. And I said I will not show you a film, but I actually will show you a clip with a yellow face, right? So this, of course, came from the tradition of the minstrel shows, and it was the practice of putting blackface on white actors who then portrayed African Americans. And so from a contemporary perspective, especially when we talk to young people who haven't seen this, it's almost hard cognitively to imagine that an audience would see a white character assuming that they were playing a black character. But that was a practice, and it was ultimately to uphold the law against miscegenation, right? So you would have you would have mixed characters, right? Black and white in a film, but all the actors would be white and then would wear blackface. Now, very often blackface, and you can see this here in the visual, are associated with exaggerated features, but also caricature exaggerated behaviors, right? They would be particularly inept, particularly clown-like, right? And so the way in which we think about this in film studies is that it's almost a double form of discrimination, right? It's the African-American body or person is not present, but then the representation becomes even exaggerated. So it's both a displacement, they're not there at all, but then their representation is an exaggerated caricature. And the other thing, I mean, in general, I'm giving you a little bit of a historical overview here. I'm going to show you some examples, but I did want to make one point that is really comes out of the discipline of film studies. That is that scholars who work on race in film argue that race in America has really been deeply ingrained in the history of film. So it's not just about either the material conditions or just about the representation within the film, but the argument that the way in which America conceives of race was central to the history of film itself and the structure of film. And that's a little bit what I'm trying to show today. And so one important film for that argument in the United States is The Jazz Singer. And it's important because it was the quote unquote first sound film. I don't know whether any of you have seen it. If you haven't seen it and you are not familiar with silent film, you will find it really weird, to be honest. It's a really strange experience from a contemporary perspective. We have in the film a character who's actually Jewish, so he's part of a minority in New York City. He's the son of a cantor, but he becomes a jazz singer in blackface. And the film itself doesn't have synchronous sound. So when they're talking, they actually still have intertitles. It's only when he sings in his role within the film that we have sound. However, the film itself in the history of film in the United States was crucially important and a spectacle as the first sound film. So film scholars argue is it's not a coincidence that the first sound film or the invention of editing, right? That race and ethnicity and the way in which they were configured at that time in the United States plays such a crucial role in those films. So I said I would talk about Griffith, and so I'm giving you a little bit of background. He lived from 1875 to 1948. He is one of the most important and influential directors in early American cinema. And particularly known for two things that are important in film studies. One is called continuity editing, and that is that film footage and material is cut together in a way that you think you're watching a continuous story, right? So when you watch a film, you're not thinking, oh, why are they suddenly over there? They were just over there, because you assume that they walked from A to B. And that's because of the way in which the film was shot, that it creates this illusion of a continuous space and time that happens in the film. This is not something that magically appeared when film was invented. It is something that filmmakers discovered throughout the very late, the 1890s to the 1920s, right? That's the period when directors started to hone their crafts of storytelling. The other thing is melodrama. Melodrama, very melodramatic. If you've seen Soundford, I'm sorry, I'm doing it myself. You have very dramatic gestures, but also often very tragic. We as the audience know the lovers should find each other. We can see them, but they can't see each other. And because they can't see each other, they have to die. Or one has to die and the other one has to suffer. And we as the audience know that they should find each other. That's what's called the melodramatic structure of two-day. And so Griffith was very famous for these two features. I am briefly gonna talk about The Birth of a Nation, which was his most famous and infamous film. And I know that Jeffrey Adler also knows about this film. That is his period, 1915. It is a film based on Thomas Dixon novel, The Klansman. It is a story about the birth of the Ku Klux Klan and the Civil War. So you can imagine that that in itself, from a contemporary perspective, is inherently racist. At the time, there was some controversy about the film, but Jeff Adler also always likes to point out that it was shown in the White House, so there was also certain kind of acceptance of that kind of film. Now, in film studies, we don't just think about the story, right? Story of the birth of the Ku Klux Klan. We also think about how the story is being told. And so this is what film scholars talk a lot about in terms of Birth of the Nation as a paradigm of racist structure in film and visual representation. And you see here the image that I was talking about before of blackface, right? So you have to imagine that a white audience at the time would really see this character as an African-American, but the African-American is inherently predatory. And he's particularly predatory vis-a-vis the white woman. So it's not just about race, but it's also how race and gender intersect, that the white woman always becomes the object that needs to be saved, and the black-faced African-American male is the threat. And it's always the threat of rape. And then in Birth of a Nation, the kind of, so what I'm saying here is the kind of melodramatic, personal, individual story is at the core of the larger historical narrative of quote unquote birth of the nation. And that intimate story is based on that kind of projection and representation of Black masculinity and white femininity. And in the film, the woman jumps off the cliff, saves herself. And so basically what the film is saying is, on a simplest level, African-American male are rapists and violence, and they have to head back. And that's why you need the Klan. And white women, if there's danger, they should better just kill themselves. So this is at the core of a discussion about race in film studies. Now, Griffith wasn't as easily identifiable as sort of, racist, reactionary. There's a way in which he was also a funded United Artists with Charlie Chaplin, Mary Pickford, Douglas Fairbanks, Charlie Chaplin, who was seen as progressive. And after he made this film, Birth of a Nation, he made another film called Broken Blossom from 1919. And that is a very interesting film because, sorry, that's not helpful here. Okay, sorry, I thought I had another clip here, but Broken Blossom is a very interesting film because it actually does not take place in the United States. It takes place in England, and it's the story of an Asian man who comes to England to spread civilization, and he meets this young girl, the daughter of a brute, like a working class, uncivilized, violent man, and they have this kind of love, but that's not consummated. And so there's a discussion about, did Griffith sort of regret racist film, Birth of the Nation, and did he make a film that then tried to do and sort of be more generous and bring cultures together? Or does it still have the same underlying structure of you cannot bring members of different cultures together, that is against miscegenation, that's against purity of races, the Asian character can never be the hero? So this discussion we have in film studies, and I want to just show you. So it features Lillian Gish, who was both part of Birth of the Nation and Broken Blossom. And you see the kind of star image of her. And so she was this, punch for her violent father. You see her again, in this, and then you see the father as the violent, and you have the Asian character. So the Asian character, however, and this is where, the question of stereotypes and is it more than just representation on the screen comes in. The Asian character is also played by a white man. So it's called Yellowface, right? And when you see the film, and I will show you a clip, but you won't see it in that clip, but something I discussed with my students this semester, it's not just that it's a white man who, they fix their eyes and they give them long hair, but it's also the way he moves. So he's always kind of sneaky, he's always on the wall and along the wall. And so the students and I discussed, they're almost like he doesn't have a spine, like he doesn't have masculinity, he's feminized. And one of the ways, again, how we talk about this in film studies is looking at the lighting. This is what we call soft lighting, right? So traditionally, men are lit with hard lighting, so they have strong contours so that they're, express masculinity. And women are, as you see, in our Lillian Gish, soft lighting. So you have the hair and you have the light and it's angelic and, there's this kind of diffuse quality to women. Whereas, you see with the masculine, you have like sharp contours often or sharp contrasts, and so one of the things that happens in filmmaking, and that's why I'm saying it's not just about what we see on the screen, because lighting is something that we perceive subconsciously. When we go to the movies, we don't think, oh, look, there's like a soft lighting. I mean, I do, but you don't. There is an unconscious way in which this works. And so that's, I think, what's also important in terms of film analysis, right? That Asian American men, the stereotype is not that they're brutal and that they're dangerous, but that they actually cannot be the hero. They cannot be the love interest because they are feminized themselves. And because they're feminized, they cannot ultimately be attractive. And so what happens is that he takes care of the girl. This is his parlor. You see also very decorative. It's Orientalist, but it's also very feminized, like, right? There's lots of fabric, lots of tactility. and he ultimately cannot save her, and then he kills himself, which is interesting because in Birth of the Nation, the woman kills herself not to be raped, and he kills himself because he cannot be with the girl, but he couldn't be with the girl because it's impossible in the story. And so film studies, what people talk about is that that there is a way in which Griffith created this narrative, maybe as a counterpoint to the obvious racism of Birth of a Nation, but that it is still underwritten by stereotypes that are both visible, but also invisible and created through the structure of the film. And that even though might appear, the Asian character might appear idealized, he still cannot be the love interest. Okay, I think I'm speaking more quickly than I'm supposed to, but we do have good time. So I will go to the clip even though I have to toggle a little bit. So what I want to show you is the opening of Broken Blossom. So I just told you the entire story of Yellow Man's love interest for the girl of the brutal boxer. And I'm going to see that I can show you the opening clip. And I think what I'm trying to show you here is that there is a certain ambivalence over how to represent Asia, right? It's not entirely bad. It's not negative in an obvious way. You would actually quite idealized. But what we see is it's not an actual country. We don't know where they are. And there is this kind of, you know, as I said, yellow face, this projection of how the West then imagines the East. And so it's like, it's without time, without place. And that's a different kind of stereotype of the East. Sorry, there's something in the chat. Okay, lost the volume, but everybody, Adla, can you give me a thumbs up again? You could hear me? Yeah. Okay. So thank you. Let me get the clip. Okay, so if I assume you can see this share and you can see me, and for some reason right now I can't see you. So was that okay? Does Jeff, can you give me a thumbs up? Okay, I don't know why I don't see you right now, but we're gonna here we were. We're just gonna continue. So one of the things that is particularly interesting about the clip that I just showed you of Griffith's Blossom is the way in which you could see that there were, you know, real life characters, life street scenes, authentic shots. And people think of this as almost an ethnographic view of Asian country, but that the moment that we have a central character, then it goes to a fake, right? It goes to a yellow face. And so it is almost as if the, you know, the value of a participating character cannot be enacted by an Asian character. So I am going to move on now to Oscar Micheaux. And like I said at the beginning, we had a segregated film industry, and Oscar Micheaux is particularly interesting because he was somebody who created his own vision and his own studio very differently than the race film studios before him, but also very differently than Hollywood. So scholars really think of him as being in between the typical dominant Hollywood system and alternative. He wasn't really alternative, but he made films himself. He was African American, and he circulated them for African Americans. So race cinema itself emerged around 1910 and ended around 1940s with the integration of Hollywood, right? So roughly between World War I and World War II. And one of the things that I do want to say, and that's sort of one of the tragic histories of film and maybe culture in general in the United States, is that with integration in Hollywood, the roles for African Americans and Asian Americans and any kinds of minorities then became much more limited. So if you remember, I started out by saying that those production companies that did race films had differentiated characters. But once African Americans were actually playing in Hollywood films, then they became reduced to being the maid and the butler and the servant. And then those stereotypes that I talked about associated with blackface came back in. So there's a real double-edged sword in terms of people, of course, arguing for integration, but that integration didn't immediately benefited all African American film workers. So Micheaux himself was a very productive, very prolific director. He did 22 silent features between 1919 and 1930. He catered to African American moviegoers. And however, he was not uncontroversial. And that's also a very interesting phenomena. He was not uncontroversial among whites. You know, there were conflicts around race. Jeffrey Adler talked about it last week. You know, there were riots. It was not a time when movie owners necessarily wanted to show films that addressed conflicts between whites and blacks, because similar to the way people think now that movie games incite violence, they thought those films would increase violence. So he was not necessarily liked by the white establishment. He was also not necessarily liked by African American establishment. And the reason was that he's very critical of religion. So when you watch his films, very often there is a preacher who tricks his congregation out of money. And that did not sit well with the establishment of sort of African American communities. Very often they yearn for something more uplifting. Sorry, I just have a reference here for a film. So the film I want to talk about, and this is his most famous film, Within Our Gates from 1920. And on the left, you see the two of the main characters, very extensive cast. On the right, you see Oscar Micheaux while filming that film. Some people see Within Our Gates as a response to Griffith's Birth of a Nation. It's a very complex film, and unfortunately, when you watch it these days, sometimes it's really hard to follow because silent films have a different kind of narrative. As I said before, editing wasn't that familiar to directors yet. It doesn't flow as well as we expect, but it also has a lot of flashbacks and narrative. And so it often takes people who are not used to silent film, maybe 1, 2, 3 times to watch it to understand what happens. So what happens in the within the film, a school plays a role that needs funding, and so I always show the Julius Rosenwald schools that were built for rural Black children. And so what happens in the film? Sorry, do I have a no? Okay, sorry. Let's go back to this shot. What happens in the film that Alma, this is Alma, wants to get funding for a Black poor school in the South. And so the entire film is her traveling between the South, trying to get money for the school, and the North, where she meets her future husband. But also she almost, and Boston, and she almost gets run over and she saves a child. And by coincidence, she meets a rich white who then gives her money for the school. And then at the end, she marries the doctor. So you see already, maybe from my very brief storytelling, that it has white characters, it has Black characters, it has Southerners, it has Northerners, it has doctors, it actually also has criminals, it has policemen, it has kind of negative characters. The cousin here, the other one in the image, is trying to trick Alma to get her husband, her first fiance. So in the story, Alma, her cousin, tells Alma's story to the future fiance. And that's the story of the Black trauma. And that is that Alma was raised by a Black family of sharecroppers, and they were lynched, and she had to run away, and she's traumatized by that. And in that story, she gets sexually accosted, but it's actually her white father who raped her mother, which we don't, it's never said explicitly, but it's part of the story. And so what this film does in a way is it's kind of almost an inversion of what Griffith did. If you think back to, I said Griffith at the heart of Birth of a Nation is a potential rape scene. And then the political national narrative is based on that. Here, it's almost the opposite. She has to move through the national trauma of African Americans to have the happy end at the end. And we will have a happy end at the end. So that's the interesting part here. So just a little bit more about how Oscar Micheaux was unusual, singular for his time. So I gave you the dates. He lived in the Midwest, very unusual for filmmaking. Filmmaking was on the East Coast and then moved to Hollywood. He was a homesteader, he had his own production company. And then, like I said, he was somewhat controversial, both in the white and Black community. A lot of his films were lost. Like I said at the beginning, African Americans didn't often have as many films circulating. Once there was integration in Hollywood, nobody cared about the race films. So this film, Within Our Gates, until maybe 3 or 4 years ago, was only available from an archive in Spain with Spanish intertitles. So the original was lost. And there is a trend now to restore these films. And I'm going to show you, like, this is a box set of African-American silent films. And I'm going to send the title to Julie so that she can forward it to you. As I said, films were lost. He was controversial. The film has a happy ending, and that's what I'm going to show you. So it's not very dramatic, but it's just so that you see how African-American self-representation happened, or what form that would take if it's not, you know, by a race, through a racist structure and organization of images. So at the end, and this might not be that not known to you, you might know this, but my students would know this. So Dr. Vivian and Sylvia are, you know, in love at the end. And Dr. Vivian, when he basically asked her to marry, mentioned Cuba, which was the Buffalo Soldier Regiment of 1898. So that was an African-American regiment. Carizal in Mexico, also African-American soldiers. And then he mentions France, also an African-American regiment. So you see how when he asks her to marry him, he's actually invoking the entire African-American sort of recent history in the nation. Okay, Jeff, did you see all the images? Yes, great. Okay, I'm gonna do the complicated thing with the clip again, and then that will be our last clip. So this is the end of Within Our Gates by Oscar Micheaux. You have Alma, the main character, who's worked through the entire trauma, what we've seen through flashback and storytelling. She got the money from the white woman for the school in the South, and Dr. Vivian is now asking her to marry him. So let me just see that I can do this. Sorry, little technical issue here. I have to do this again. Let's see. Okay, so I'm actually not going back to my PowerPoint. That was the end of the presentation. So I wanted to show you this clip. It seems, not very dramatic, not a lot of action. It's a lot of dialogue, which is strange in silent cinema. But just to show you how there's that invocation of patriotism at the end, which is important. And we think of it as a counter film to Birth of a Nation, right? There's a claim to being participating in the nation, and that is the precondition for the happy couple. So I think it's a very different understanding of, African American, of the couple at the end of a film, where, the belonging to the nation is a precondition for the couple forming. And I would say that my students always have a hard time at the ending. They always think, oh, now the woman has to subordinate herself, and they become so patriotic and nationalist. But I think an audience at the time would have understood that that's a real claim by African Americans, that they are full citizens of the nation, and that their personal happiness is part of that and belongs to that. So I will just end it here and open up for questions.
Hey, who has questions for Barbara or comments on the presentation? Keith?
Ellen, I have one here in the open.
Keith?
Yeah, I think there's a live one.
Could you comment on how music was supplied and the place of music in being integrated into the film?
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear it.
Barbara,
I couldn't hear it either.
how was music integrated into the film?
Oh, that's a very good question. Thank you. Sorry, that's a really good question. So music traditionally was live. So the music that you have now, that was not necessarily the music that played with the films. So music was live, and so that means it depended on what the theater had. So very common was a piano in the theater, right? Sometimes they would have records. So very big budget films would have a whole orchestra. Sometimes what would be happening, and as you know, sorry, now I'm giving you a job example, like Metropolis in 1927 would have a very big opening in Berlin with a full orchestra. And then the film would travel through the countryside. And then, of course, there wouldn't be a full orchestra. So maybe in a local movie theater, there would be one man who could play the piano. So if you have not seen silent film with live piano accompaniment, if there's ever a chance to do so, I highly recommend it. Those piano players are incredibly, yes, I get back to Keith's question. Thank you for typing it up. So those piano players that accompany silent film are super impressive because they do not have a score. What they did at the time was that certain features in film have certain kinds of themes, like chase, right? Like the chase film is fast, the romance is slow. So, and they would do that while they watched the film. So one time I watched a film in Germany with live accompaniment, and my friend asked the piano player, oh, where are your notes? And he said, oh, they're in the film. They actually watch the film while they play on the piano. Now, as I talked about segregated cinema, you can imagine that at the time, African-American communities and movie theaters had less resources. So you can also imagine they might not have live accompaniment. So you could have silent cinema really be watched silent at the time, or with some kind of live accompaniment. Okay, Keith asked the question in the chat that these two main characters at the end of Within Our Gates seem to have white features. And there is a way in which Micheaux was also criticized at the time and sometimes nowadays, what people are discussing again right now as being colorist, meaning that very often his main characters or the positive characters had less African American features and were more light skinned. I think it is accurate. I think if we would watch all his films, that we could see that there was a correlation between both, and it would be interesting. Sorry, I haven't done it, but it would be interesting to look at both in terms of the importance in the narrative, but also their class and professional status and whether they're Northern or Southern within the narrative. Now, in this instance, of course, it is the educated, Dr. Vivian is a doctor, right? He's actually an eye doctor, right? So there is also something about, and I'm a female character, comes from this mixed background, raised by scarecroppers, but was always a good person, right? We know that because she tried to get money for the school and for education. So there is a whole discourse about uplift, and there is a critique of Micheaux that discourse of uplift is tied, of course, with morality, but also education, but also racial features. So I think that's a very astute observation, Keith. And yeah, so I think, I mean, to me, personally, you know, what it shows is how challenging it is to escape these kinds of really deep, deep rooted values associated with race and the kind of embodiment of race that even somebody as radical and unafraid that Micheaux was, because I mean, we know that from him criticizing preachers when he wanted to make money as an African-American filmmaker in the 1920s means like he was not afraid. So it means that to me, that means, and that also goes back to Jeffrey Adler's talk last time about implicit bias, like it's sort of, you know, how deeply ingrained are these preconceived notions that they still play out with somebody like Oscar Micheaux.
Well, thank you. I don't see any other questions here in our Oak Room or on chat.
Galia.
Oh, Galina, go ahead, unmute.
Yes, can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
I was wondering whether that film about the yellow face, because that was in time, had any connection to Puccini's opera Madame Butterfly, because in that opera we have an American carefree, careless, who takes advantage of a Japanese girl, and he also comes as a superior human being. Everybody assumes that he's superior. Well, he's not educating anyone, but he is educating his bride in inverted commas. So I was just wondering if there was any connection, because in the original story, the main character was Italian, but Puccini chose to transform him into an American.
That's interesting. I will say that I don't know. I would say, so I don't know about the very concrete, it's based on a British short story. And Griffith changed significant things from that short story. So in the short story, he's not called Yellow Man. So there's a way in which in the short story, it is a love story and it is consummated. So Griffith changed it, and in a certain way, film scholarship thinks of like made it more racist. I will say I don't know about the specifics, but I would say in general, this kind of Orientalism was very fashionable in the 1920s, right? You think about fashion, if you think about design, decor, architecture, interior design, and I'm just reading a book about color in the 1920s and modernity, this notion of the Orient is this kind of decorative, feminized, seductive, seductive. I mean, like, I think that's always part of this, seductive, but then sort of at the end, ultimately unable to deliver. So I think, even though I don't know the exact answer to your question, I think there is a way in which it was in the air. And I will also say, I mean, until 4 years ago, we have a 16 millimeter copy at UF, and I used to teach it. I used to actually teach it on celluloid projected. And because I will say that I also find it really beautiful. It is more beautiful in terms of, and you didn't maybe see this, maybe you saw this already in that short clip. What they used to do with silent cinema is also decorate the intertitles. It's not just the language, but they would have ornamentation. And so there is, I think, beyond, you know, the specific relationship that you're asking about, a kind of cultural circulation of that kind of aesthetic.
Inversion.
Huh?
The inversion, I was just wondering whether they were writing back to the opera, because there by the end, you're disappointed in this young American. You feel that he's a real bastard, because not only she kills herself, but he also takes her child back with his sort of American wife.
There is another film, I think, Galia, you and I have to talk separately, because there's another film with Mae Wong, an American film, Tall of the Sea, that is actually a rewrite. So, so there might be, I mean, Griffith was in 1919, so his is earlier, Tall of the Sea later. So there might be more films that are in conversation with each other. But as I said, the Asian characters very often played in yellow face. And maybe that's also something interesting to think about. When are Asian women allowed not to be in yellow face, but the men are in yellow face? So that's also sort of a curious thing, because Anna Mae Wong, of course, plays, she is Asian American, and she does play an Asian character. Thank you.
Barbara, I have a question. Eventually, we moved from the silent films to audio, and eventually blackface died out. But the discrimination against blacks did not. So, what is responsible for, even though we moved towards audio, films with audio, what is responsible for not continuing the perseverance of blackface in audio films?
Okay, I'm not 100% sure that I also heard this question, but if I, maybe what I understood was kind of like, why was there ongoing discrimination and stereotype and underfunding of African American once we have sound film? Is that a way that I understood your question correctly? I mean, basically what happens after World War I is, like you have the 1950s, the most famous film is Imitation of Life, is the story of a white woman and her maid, right? So there's this real reduction of African American to roles of maids or helpers. Very often, even contemporary, very often they're in a kind of secondary role, right? And then in the 70s following 68, right, and sort of the Black liberation movements, you have what's called blaxploitation. And the first crews that made films were actually porn crews, because they were not unionized. And the unions prevented African Americans from participating. So I think part of why film, what the problem with film is that it's so much, it's money driven. It's a very big apparatus. It's not like literature where somebody can just write a poem and become famous as a poet, and they don't really need anything except paper and pen. For film, it's an industry, and because it's an industry, I think it's what's harder, both for men and women, to break in. And I think it's that structure, that industry is something very complex that has interest in money, changes much more slower, and you need much more capital and connections to break in. than, for example, in literature or music, you know, where you just need your one instrument, or singing. You know, you could become a singer. You don't need an industry to become a singer. But for film, you need an entire industry that was already in place and had already excluded you. So I think that's sort of the challenge of film. And that's, I think, why, you know, I started out by talking about production and consumption and distribution, that there's a whole apparatus. And to change a whole apparatus, it's much harder than to change sort of one aspect of culture.
Does anybody else have, Jeffrey, you have a question?
Oh, you muted though.
And unmute yourself, Jeffrey.
Racial segregation persisted through the era you described. Why didn't the niche market of African-American films made by African-American directors persist when segregation did?
That's a good question. And honestly, I don't really know. I think it goes sort of beyond of what I know, but my hunch is that it was never that lucrative. I mean, like, if it would have been that lucrative, there would have been a second Hollywood, right? But it really wasn't. And I think we can tell that also the star system. I mean, as you say, segregation existed. So it was harder for stars, right? You couldn't really be a star who could be celebrated and go everywhere. So the whole sort of structure on which Hollywood is based, right? The star system that emerged was also not there at the very beginning. It's based on access. And so my assumption is that Hollywood as a studio system was exclusionary. And those other, I mean, there's a reason why race studios were on the East Coast. In the Midwest, they were actually not in Hollywood. And so I think, yeah, they must have just not had the resources, both in terms of movie houses, in terms of consumption. You know, I mean, you know this, African Americans had less money. And so I think it's like a confluence of reasons. But it's a good question. Like, when did they, and you know, like Micheaux is the most famous one. The Jacksonville is relatively famous. So if there were only a few famous ones, it's not like there were many coming in. So, okay, well, thank you very much. And thank you for the discussion. And I will be back to hear Gaia and Andy Wahlberg.
Thank you very much.
Very, very much. It was a great presentation.